Alright, we're back, APUSH people, trying to help you score a 5 on that exam. Today we are taking a look at the Trans-Mississippi West and what was going down with farmers from the period 1865 to 1896. If you're using any APUSH book, this video will help you out. There's how it lines up with those 3 books right there. Now in other videos we've already seen people moving out west, but in this video we're taking a look at largely the settlement of the Great Plains region. And really important point to keep in mind is the federal government is going to actively promote economic development and the movement west. What does that mean? Well, if you recall, during the Civil War, we had something called the Homestead Act passed by Congress in 1862. And the Homestead Act offered public land up to 160 acres to any person who lived on the land and improved it for a period of 5 years. And you could get your title to the land. Now, this was intended to encourage settlement of the West, but there are difficulties and limitations to the Homestead Act. It was an enormous opportunity, but very often the quality of land that was available was rather poor. There's a high cost of supplies. You have to buy the equipment, even though the land is relatively cheap, if not free. You have to buy all the farming equipment, Mother Nature, from droughts to too cold, too hot, everything in between. There's a lot of fraud where very often it would be speculators getting the best land out in the West, and crop prices fluctuated, which left farmers in a very difficult situation. There also was another example of the government helping Western settlement, and that is also during the Civil War with the Pacific Railroad Act in 1862, and it authorized the building of the Transcontinental Railroad along a northern route. And the federal government is going to help this process because they're going to provide money and land subsidies to the railroad companies to construct this project. And of course, in 1869, it will be completed, transforming life in the West forever. So what are people doing out in the West? What was the economy like? And it's really important you understand that there was a boom and bust cycle to this economy. Enormous profits followed by huge economic collapse very often. You see this in the mining industry. There's a whole bunch of mining booms. You can see them on the map. You know, California Gold Rush is the most famous one, but you have in 1858 gold being discovered at Pikes Peak in Colorado, the famous Comstock lode in 1859 in Nevada, and that leads to Nevada entering the Union as a state relatively quickly. And these conditions in the mines were very, very difficult. It's extremely dangerous. A lot of people are coming in. You know, overnight these towns would emerge with nearly half of the people living in these towns being foreign born. We got people from Latin America, from Asia, from Europe, and from the United States in these mining towns. So they're like this melting pot of people. 1/3 of the people in the mining towns on the West Coast were Chinese immigrants. And the mining industry is going to have a huge impact, especially with the environment. Hydraulic mining, where they're using high cost equipment to try to access the material, the minerals, is going to devastate the environment. And of course, when more and more people come out, you're going to have conflict with Native people, which will lead to the loss of Native American land. Another important industry in the West is the cattle industry, and really you got to keep in mind that the Spanish and then the Mexican cowboys, the vaqueros, had been doing this for a very long time before Texas was a part of the United States. And the concept is simple, right? You take these cattle and you transport them along this vast open grass. Basically, they get to eat for free. And the American cattle industry starts to grow, and the railroad really opens up new markets. As you saw, the cows go up to the north to cities such as Dodge City or Abilene, Kansas, and you transport those cows to eastern markets. And once again, just like the mining industry, boom and bust cycle, because very often you would have things like bad winters where it would be really cold and the cows would die, prices would drop, overgrazing where the grass would run out. Farmers are eventually going to put up barbed wire fencing, which is going to cause all sorts of problems between the farmers and the cattlemen, and as a result, you have the boom and bust continuing. That you need to keep in mind when we're talking about the West is the myth versus the reality. There's a very romanticized view of the American West, and you could see that in literature, paintings, and of course the famous dime novels. And very often in these dime novels you have these cowboys roaming the frontier, all romantic view of these brave honorable men. Oftentimes, they ignore the complexity of Native American life and the reality of life in the West as very difficult, lonely, and challenging. One of the things about the West that's really unique is the melting pot nature of the American West. Like we've already said, you have huge amounts of Chinese immigrants coming in, so you have a vibrant Chinese community. They are going to be, of course, with the California Gold Rush, great photo. You see all these different groups together trying to strike it rich. And then, of course, with the building of the railroad, the Chinese labor is going to be an important part of that. And, of course, with that Chinese immigration comes a rise of nativism that you should know about, with the Chinese Exclusion Act eventually being passed. And a lot of the cowboys out in the West were, in fact, African American or Mexican. The original cowboys were Mexican vaqueros. The importance of religion in the West is important. A lot of different groups came out west. We saw the Mormons go west as a result of the discrimination they face, and in 1896 Utah enters the Union as a state after the church formally drops the practice of polygamy. And women's suffrage also kind of shows you the complexity of the West. It was much more common out in the West for women to have the right to vote. In fact, Wyoming is the first state to grant women the right to vote, followed by other states out in the West, such as Utah. And the reality is that is a way to encourage women to come out west, and also to honor the fact that they are playing an important role on these homesteads in these communities in the West. Now, life in the Trans-Mississippi West, of course, you really got to talk about the native people that are there, and we're going to focus on the Plains Indians out west. And there's a whole variety of people, the Sioux, the Blackfoot, the Crow, the Comanche, who make up this area in the light blue. And there's a variety of environmental factors, but really what is common with these groups is the heavy reliance on the hunting of bison. And these Native Americans' lives have already changed even before this time period, because the European introduction of the horse, it transforms mobility on the Great Plains, increases warfare between tribes, but it allows them to hunt the buffalo in new ways. The introduction of firearms, alcohol, and disease all have already had impacts on the Plains Indians. And as people are moving west as a result of these overland routes, these transcontinental railroad, these mining booms, you're going to have increasing pressure on Native American life. And this expansion of the United States is going to lead to conflict with Native people. There's going to be a severe decline in the population of the bison. You could see that on that graphic right there. And there's a variety of reasons for this. One, there was an attempt to undermine Native American resistance by killing the bison. There's a demand for buffalo hides out in the east. There's the impact of the railroad expansion. As you build the railroads, you want to get rid of the buffalo so they don't get in the way of its operation. And as a result of this expansion out west into native land, the biggest impact of Western expansion will take place upon the lives of Native Americans in the Trans-Mississippi West. Really important you know that. And that is going to lead to horrible conflict that is known as the Indian Wars. And there's a whole variety of examples that we can give you. We're going to focus on a few, but you can see on those red stars, different places, different conflicts. Violence occurs as the homesteaders, miners, and ranchers move west into native land. Sand Creek is a sad example of what this violence looked like. In 1864, the Colorado militia attacks and kills over 100 native people in Colorado, many of them women and children. Battle of Little Bighorn takes place in 1876, where the Sioux tribe, inspired by their leader and others, Sitting Bull, for example, kills Custer, a U.S. Army officer, and his men in the 7th Cavalry. This becomes known as Custer's Last Stand. And about 264 members of the regiment were killed by the Sioux Indians. However, that victory will be short-lived because the U.S. Army will respond with force. And another example is with Chief Joseph, who tries to lead members of the Nez Perce tribe into Canada along the route you see on the map. And eventually, he and his tribal members are captured by the U.S. government, and he surrenders in 1877. And the big one that you should definitely know about is the Battle of Wounded Knee. And what happens there is a ghost dance movement develops amongst the Sioux Indians in Dakota Territory. And many of the Sioux Indians believe that this ghost dance was going to bring a revival. It was a cultural and religious revival for the tribal members. And they thought that this would return their tribe to greatness, and also lead to white settlers to leave. And the government of the United States wants to stop this because settlers are coming into Sioux territory and they want these native people to be confined to their reservations. And of course, the moment of tragedy happens in 1890 at the Battle of Wounded Knee, where the U.S. Army goes into the Dakotas and kills over 200 native people. Many, again, women and children. This battle really, it's almost unfair to call it a battle. It's really a massacre. You could see one of the bodies laying in the frozen aftermath. And it marks, the Battle of Wounded Knee, important you know, marks the end of the major Native American frontier wars. It's kind of like the final big war. And historians have documented this. Great book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by D. Brown, taking a look at the Native American perspective of expansion. And there were attempts at assimilation. In fact, some people began to question the U.S. government's treatment of the native people. That beautiful woman right there, Helen Hunt Jackson, wrote a book in 1881 called A Century of Dishonor, in which she documents the mistreatment by the federal government of native people. Some people advocated that boarding schools such as Carlisle Indian School, they would eliminate their native culture and become assimilated into American society. And other supporters of this kind of approach of assimilation as the answer supported the Dawes Severalty Act in 1887. And this was intended to end tribal ownership of land. And what it did was basically reservations would be split up into 160-acre private farms. Native Americans had to adopt this kind of private property approach, and they had the potential to receive citizenship if they lived on the land for 25 years and adopted the habits of civilized life. So they're supposed to promote Christianity, job training, separate their culture, was the solution, some felt. And the remaining land was very often sold to white settlers. Oftentimes this was the best land, and it was a massive failure. The Dawes Act was a massive failure for Native Americans, and through war and through other means, the population of Native people in the Great Plains region dramatically drops, and you could see the land shrinkage right there. And in 1890s, there's this idea that the frontier has closed, and kind of the last big land rush takes place in Oklahoma territory. If you recall, that's where Andrew Jackson, during the Trail of Tears, the Indian Removal of Act, had put the native people in Oklahoma, what is called Indian Territory, and they open up settlement in 1889, and there's a huge land rush where suddenly now the native people are being forced to relocate again. And a famous historian, make sure you know about him, Frederick Jackson Turner in 1893, writes the significance of the frontier in American history. And he basically argues that in the 1890s, he uses the census data from the U.S. Census that the frontier has closed. And really, he talks about in his work the importance of the frontier on American identity. It made America independent, individualistic, and it was this place that had opportunity for people. And it's this idea of the safety valve theory, that you could always head west when the times were tough. You can leave and go west and start over and start anew. Of course, historians have since kind of criticized Jackson Turner's interpretation because it does ignore the contributions of the people that are already there, women, and the fact that in reality, by 1890s, most people were not heading west. They were in fact moving to urban cities looking for industrial jobs. So the frontier thesis, though, is extremely important in American history and American identity, the idea of the frontier. An important concept to kind of keep in mind for a later APUSH material is in the 1890s, though, you are going to see this emphasis on overseas expansion in places like Cuba and the Philippines. So one frontier closes, a new one is opened. Really quickly, we're going to run down what farmers were up to at this time. Farming was becoming more commercialized and specialized. Farmers were focusing on single cash crops like wheat or corn, and life was difficult for farmers. They were susceptible to falling prices. If you made too much, your crop price went down. Unfair railroad business practices, especially from shippers, the high cost of machinery. You had to pay a lot of money to buy this new equipment, and very often you went in deep debt that you had difficulty paying off. The tight money supply, they wanted more money in circulation. They did not want gold as the answer. And of course, high tariffs, which were supported by Republican administrations. And so these problems lead farmers to organize. And one of the first ones, national movements amongst farmers, is the Grange movement by Oliver Kelly. And really, they organize social and educational activities for farmers, but later on they're going to demand collective reforms. They want government regulation and ownership of businesses. They don't want these railroads to have this huge amount of power that they had. And they start lobbying state legislators for reforms, and they get some laws passed, and the courts uphold those laws. Munn versus Illinois, basically the court rules and upholds one of the Granger laws by saying the states could regulate the railroad industry. That is overturned in the Wabash case, where the court reverses and says states cannot regulate interstate commerce, and of course that will lead later on to the passage of the Interstate Commerce Act. Another farmers movement you should be aware of is the Farmers Alliance. They're founded in Texas in the 1870s. They're going to have problems because basically farmers were divided amongst themselves. They excluded African Americans. In fact, there is the Colored Farmers Alliance that is formed. They ignore tenant farmers, farmers that do not own the land. But both the Farmers Alliance and the Grange movement will eventually kind of lead to this new political party, a significant third party called the Populist Party. And they have a platform. They're going to run candidates such as James Weaver for president in 1892. They want government ownership of the railroads. They want the free and unlimited coinage of silver. They want to increase the money supply. They want a graduated income tax where the rich people pay more. And they want to reform politics by having a direct election of senators. And they want to use political reforms such as the initiative and the referendum. So farmers are starting to organize in response to this changing nature of the economy. And then let's close out the 19th century really quickly here. There's a growing frustration, a big idea over the laissez-faire capitalist system. We saw how the farmers are dealing with it, with the Grange movement, the Alliance movement, and the Populist political party, but you also have industrial problems. In 1892, there's the Homestead strike, where workers at Carnegie Steel are defeated by Henry Clay Frick and Andrew Carnegie. There's a panic of 1893 where basically as a result of over-speculation, the stock market crashes. This causes huge economic problems. Unemployment goes up, and the president at the time, Grover Cleveland, continues his laissez-faire approach. He's not going to get involved. There is a demand for the government to do something. Coxey's army marches on Washington, D.C. It was unemployed men who marched to D.C. demanding that the federal government hire the jobless, the unemployed, to do public works jobs. And those people, Coxey himself and his followers, are arrested for trespassing, and the government ignores the plight of the workers. In fact, the government once again steps in on behalf of business during the Pullman strike in 1894. President Cleveland uses the army and a court injunction to defeat the strike led by Eugene Debs and the American Railway Union. And as you're going to see in the election of 1896, you're going to have the Republican William McKinley running against a young whippersnapper, William Jennings Bryan. He's going to deliver his Cross of Gold speech where he calls for the free and unlimited coinage of silver. The Democratic Party takes some of the populist ideas, and in the election, the Republican William McKinley wins. The Populist Party kind of fades away, and we will check out what happens under President McKinley in another video. If you have any questions, you can post a comment. If you haven't done so, subscribe and tell all your classmates to do the same so we can get that 5 on this APUSH exam. And thank you for watching. Have a beautiful day, a beautiful night. Peace.